Good evening, everybody. I'm Barbara Shipnuck. I'm the president of the National Council of Jewish Women in Greater Long Beach and West Orange County, and I'm delighted to have you all here this evening. The National Council of Jewish Women welcomes women and men, folks who are Jewish, folks who are not, because we want to work with like-minded individuals who believe in the same issues that we believe in. We are an advocacy organization, and we work on issues that affect women, children, and families, and strive for equality among the various different issues that we focus on. And tonight's program is a perfect example of that. Reproductive rights has been a signature issue for the National Council in its 125-year history and the 75-year history of the section here in Long Beach. So I hope that you learn a lot tonight. We'll be happy to have some of your questions responded to. And I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia Gordon to do some of the housekeeping that's very important and make the introductions for this evening. Cynthia is our co-vice president for advocacy for the section. And Cynthia, turn it to you.
Okay, I'm really happy to welcome all of you tonight. This promises to be an exceptional evening of discussion and learning. And our program tonight is actually part of a nationwide effort by NCJW and sections all across the country to raise our collective Jewish voices about the critical importance of reproductive justice, health access, and reproductive rights. And we couldn't ask for a better panel of speakers to address the state of reproductive justice today. We will have a special focus on California and particularly challenges for women of color. We look forward to learning how, in particular, we can be allies and advocates in NCJW to fight back against the current social and legal assaults on women's bodies. You've all been muted for this evening's discussion. You probably figured that out. We won't be taking any oral questions. We will only take questions through the chat. And if you do have a question for one of our speakers, send a direct chat message to Deb Lelchek, who is the other co-vice president for advocacy. And she marked her name as Q&A, so you'll know where to send your questions, and we will address them after the speakers have finished and get to as many as we can. I encourage all of you to remain in speaker view so that you'll see the speakers the best in the best view during the meeting. And I did want to note to everyone that we are recording this evening's discussion. We also wanted to recognize that this program was made possible in part by a grant from the Jewish Long Beach Barbara Alpert NCJW Endowment. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our three speakers. So first is Michele Goodwin. We can spotlight Michele. There she is. Many of you will remember Professor Goodwin from a pastry and politics program we had on reproductive rights back in November of 2019. So it's a while ago. It seems like an eternity ago, given our state of the environment that we're living in, when we could all gather together in person. Rest assured that we will meet again in person in the future. I don't know when, but when it's safe for all of us to do so. But for now, we'll make the most of our virtual meeting space. Professor Goodwin is a Chancellor's Professor at UC Irvine and founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. She's the recipient of the 2020-21 Distinguished Senior Faculty Award for Research, the highest honor bestowed by the University of California. She is also the first law professor at UCI to receive this award. She's an elected member of the American Law Institute, as well as an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation and the Hastings Center. As if that's not enough, she's also the host of On the Issues with Michele Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. Professor Goodwin also serves on the executive committee and national board of the ACLU. and she has a highly sought after voice on civil liberties, civil rights, reproductive rights and justice, and cultural politics. Our second speaker will be Shannon Olivieri Hovis, who is a director of Naral Pro-Choice California. Naral is the abbreviation for the National Abortion Rights Action League. She is a policy expert and political strategist. Shannon has spent her career fighting for civil and human rights with nearly 15 years of experience as a change maker in state and local government, the classroom, electoral campaigns, and mission-driven advocacy. Shannon is a proud bisexual feminist who is fiercely committed to intersectional leadership, equity, and diversity. Under her leadership, Naral Pro-Choice California has co-sponsored and passed pivotal legislation in the state that has expanded job-protected paid family leave, has expanded access to high-quality pregnancy and birth care, and has expanded abortion access at California's public universities. Other legislation has aimed to address bias and to reduce California's alarmingly high rates of Black maternal mortality. Our final speaker this evening will be Nourbese Flint, who serves as a policy director and program manager with Black Women for Wellness in Los Angeles. Here she directs environmental and reproductive health work, organizes community advocacy, and works on policy. In addition, Nourbese serves as the head of civic engagement with Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy, also known as CHANGE, where she strategically looks at the political landscape and helps design efforts to build power and address toxic chemicals as it relates to reproductive health through elections, legislative efforts, and community politics. Welcome to all our speakers. We look forward to a great discussion. And now for Professor Goodwin to start our program, please.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It is my pleasure to be back in community with you again. These are incredibly urgent times, not the least of which are the backdrops of Black Lives Matter, Breonna Taylor's tragic murder, the murder of George Floyd, the harms that we've seen before that time and since that time. And I want to set the stage for this evening's conversation, and we will be having a conversation. So I'm not presenting a paper for you. I'm more going to be talking with you. And as part of setting the stage for this evening, I believe it's really important to reach back to histories because it is history that really informs the present. That's really what was captured by what it was that we were able to see with George Floyd's murder. And I want to make a distinction because it concerns me that people didn't get out into the streets right away in the wake of Breonna Taylor's death. In fact, she had been dead 4 weeks before George Floyd was tragically lynched before so many. And I think that says a lot about the devaluing of women's lives. Of course, what we have captured in George Floyd's murder is exactly like a modern day postcard of an American lynching. These American lynchings were so popular that people would take photographs of themselves and have it memorialized in postcards. And beyond that, there's enormous cruelty that one finds in the normalization of America's addiction to Black pain. I find it fascinating that people would take their children, white people would take their children to these lynchings in their Sunday best and pack picnics. And beyond the photograph, often want to take a bit of a memento, those mementos being pieces of flesh from charred Black bodies. These are cruel realities for us to address today. I wonder what that was like for my forebears to know that those were the realities right outside of their doors. And so in this talk, we want to end on a hopeful note, but I think that it's important in setting the stage that we are cognizant that is part of doing that kind of reckoning and reconciliation. To reckon means to acknowledge and to actually deal with these issues. And if we don't, we see exactly where we end up with. And so if one were to peel away a bit of the pain and realities of today, they really start with the colonization of this nation, the stripping away of homestead and land of indigenous people, the kidnap and traffic of African peoples and African women. And that really sets the stage for so much of the pain that we see today, the sort of stripping away of rights. It has so much to do with an origin story. I can talk with you, as I will, about Bebe Shui, Regina McKnight, Lisa Epstein, Alicia Beltran, and those cases. But first, let me think a little bit about this with you. What does it mean for capitalism to be tied to reproductive oppression, rape, and sexual assault? The earliest laws in the United States related to the suppression, the oppression, the trading in the bodies of Black people. The earliest laws were defining ways to exclude Black women from citizenship, including their offspring. Some of the earliest laws, matrilineality, meaning that you'll take on the status of your mother, was quite purposeful. What it would end up securing for white men who would sexually assault Black women and rape them was that they could have myriad number of offspring and never have to worry about those offspring ever legally being able to call them daddy and inherit anything from them. Rules of hypodescent would further create these brackets around the realities of Black women and their children, meaning if you have even one ancestor at any point in your lineage, this makes you Black. Now, in countries that are not practicing racism, that have not invested in the sociology of racism and the politics of racism, no big deal. But we know what it means in the United States to forever destine someone into the category of Blackness. It is to put them inside the proverbial caste system of the United States and make sure that they are always subordinate. All we have to do is think about Jim Crow and we land squarely there. And it is this foundation of rape and of assault and torture that we've papered over in our history books and that we've even papered over in some of our feminist organizations, not lifting up sufficiently. For many years, I had no interest in visiting Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. And so many people did, and they would walk by, or if they went in, they would flush a toilet in a men's latrine, which papered over Sally Hemings, the young Black girl that he had raped for a number of years, siring 6 children by her, her own reality being one that had been complicated because she was his wife's half sister. Sort of these narratives of rape that get steeped in. And by the time that I visited, after the horrors of Charlottesville in 2017, Monticello had woken up to its own history, removing then the men's latrine and stall and acknowledging Sally Hemings had been there and her children. It's amazing, the tale of denial, the kind of papering over that happens with the misery and the pain in our country, which then forestalls, kind of blocks that needed thing of a reckoning. But if we fail to acknowledge that history, then that's why something like eugenics becomes so easy to slip into in our country. And it should be very, very hard. But eugenics becomes easy if, in fact, part of your slave enterprise was to regularly lift a billet and bid on a child or bid on a woman. And the last time that I was with you all, we were talking about this because I found it really important to think about slavery, right? And to think about how we would be so offended if we were in a movie theater and it was 20 minutes of auctioning, and there would be people who'd want to go out and they'd say, that's so gratuitous. I had to sit through 20 minutes. And imagine a country where it's not 20 minutes. It's not just an hour. It's not just a week. Laws are built around the not just a month and not just a year or a decade, but the centuries that flow in the bidding. And as we think about what reproductive justice means, right, it's not only the ability to control one's reproduction, as in to use contraception or to be able to terminate a pregnancy. It also includes being able to decide when and how you want to give birth. And it must also include thinking about one's children. And so I've been thinking, what story must a mother tell the night before she knows that her daughter will be auctioned off? What do you keep in the soul and spirit of a child to keep them whole and safe when you recognize that you may never see them again? These are the kinds of tragedies and the kind of tragic narratives that are all woven in the legacies of Blackness in the United States. It's our country becoming so numb to that, and yet Black people trying to awaken our nation to these these myriad different forms of pain that we have been through and in the reproductive sphere. And this is why then come 1927, that one could have Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the famous case, the infamous case of Buck v. Bell, one that involved Carrie Buck, who was a young, poor white girl who had been 16 years old when raped by her employer's nephew. She becomes pregnant, and the state of Virginia wants to use her as a test case because they've already locked her away in a facility called the Virginia Colony. It's a place where they had already locked her mother as well. And the state of Virginia wanted to deem, and they had deemed Carrie an unfit person. And it was these unfit people that the state of Virginia was hungry to snatch away their reproductive autonomy. These were the people that Virginia wanted to forcibly sterilize. And so Carrie's case goes up before the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court is adjudicating whether this Virginia law, which provides for compulsory sterilization, is lawful, whether it violates a constitutional right. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes says, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. He said, better than to let them starve for their imbecility or to prevent them from being incarcerated, the society is better off than forcibly sterilizing these people. He says that the laws that are broad enough to cover vaccination are broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. It's a tragic case. It becomes the open door to forced sterilization, not just in Virginia, but around the country. And again, this kind of addiction to the kind of pornography of pain, of situating poor people outside of the realms of legal protection, dignity, and autonomy in terms of their reproductive space, the reproductive selves. It's not new, which is why this could happen. And in fact, that a country that's so addicted to this kind of pornography of pain could in fact show it in a way as a form of pornography. The coming attractions in movie theaters in the 1930s in the United States, right? As we sort of sit before the film, I already talked about if we saw 20 minutes of the bidding, we'd say it's enough. Well, the coming attractions were about sterilization in the United States. And again, this is like papered over, where states would create videos about how many hundreds or thousands of people were forcibly and coercively sterilized in their states. Imagine that is the thing to be attracted by if you were able to secure a movie ticket. That says a lot about our nation. And it says even more that there were American lawmakers and legislators who then within a short period of time from there would say, the Germans are beating us at our own game. We've got to catch up. Because the very law that was adopted in Nazi Germany was based on this Virginia law. The United States exporting that pornography of pain, that kind of hatred and disregard for the humanity and dignity of other people. And so if we were to then fast forward, as my co-panelist will take us, but I want to touch on a bit, then what are the surprise journeys, right? Coming out of the belly of slavery is the time in which there begins to be this legislating, this anti-contraception, anti-abortion legislating that takes place. We know this in Roe v. Wade. It's something that Justice Blackmun talks about, how abortion had not been illegal in the United States. And it's important to mark the time in which it does happen, where lawmakers begin getting skittish about abortion. And it takes place around the time of the Civil War. And there's a reason why it takes place around the time of the Civil War, which reveals then the pattern and the pain of white supremacy in the United States connected to reproduction, because you have scholars in the American Medical Association who are doctors, Joseph DeLee, Horatio Storer, and many others who are writing about the importance of white women using and spreading their loins so that they can populate whiteness, this kind of fear of Blackness spreading. And this kind of fear is what we see in the backdrop of the last few years as well, the reason to cage children and snatch them away from their parents, this fear of the browning of our country, this fear that's never been realized, right? Black people still make up only 12 or 13% of the United States population. So then what does this mean before I turn it over to my co-panelist in terms of this arc? We've seen a kind of tension with the arc. You know, if we think about Roe v. Wade, it's a 7-2 opinion striking down these laws that criminalize abortion. But be clear, these laws are about criminalizing doctors. Around the time of the Civil War, nearly 100% of reproductive health care for women in the United States took place with women. These were the midwives. It's actually the medicalization, or we would say, because that was medical, but you see the sort of professionalization, right, of obstetrics and gynecology is what pushes them out, but it's intentional. It's these kind of men seeking to make monopolies of this space, and they successfully push women out. But it's fascinating then, the 7-2 opinion in Roe v. Wade, because 5 of that 7 happen to have been Republican appointed. And there's much more that we could talk about in terms of what that represents, you know, the deaths that one must account for of girls and women in bloody tubs and motel rooms, on kitchen tables, found on dining room tables and kitchen counters, the realities of what was endured on the way to stopping what was such an egregious state practice of limiting the ability to control one's own reproductive health and rights. And it's also important to mark 3 things during that time. One of them happens to be Dr. King receiving Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger Award in 1966. It's a brilliant speech that's worth you paying attention to and knowing about. It's George H.W. Bush shepherding Title X through Congress and Richard Nixon signing it. Title X is what provides reproductive health care for poorest of Americans, and Richard Nixon saying this is basic common sense and public health. Prescott Bush being the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. And if you could see that as the kind of markers of the 1960s and early 1970s, then you must be wondering what in the world is happening now. And this is where I would say, before I close up, and I want to talk about criminalization, but we can get to that in Q&A. But what's old is new again. So if you wonder what's happening now in legislative bodies all throughout the United States and state legislatures, there are a number of things that you see, but you cannot divorce the kind of anti-abortion, anti-contraception movement from the rise of white supremacy in this country. More than ever, hopefully, people are beginning to see where these linkages actually line up. It is noted on you don't even have to go to the dark web. It's just like regular internet. You can actually see where these linkages align, where those who are pushing white supremacist message, such as those who stormed the Capitol and rioted and insurrected at the Capitol on January 6th, were also deeply engaged in 2 things. There are a number of those people who were found to have committed acts of domestic violence, but were also part of anti-abortion movements. The 2 do align in ways that are tragic, that are historical, and that are painful. But this reckoning process, I think, is critically important before we go on to what else is happening in these times, which include, and I'll close on this, which includes the criminalization of women who are pregnant, which includes the threat of arrest for refusing C-section, which includes states intervening so that pregnant, brain-dead bodies gestate fetuses. We can talk about all of that during Q&A. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You're good.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that sets a context for our discussion, a historical context, and of course, a lot of things that are deeply disturbing to us. And you're right, we have to continue the dialogue, and we've got lots more to talk about tonight. And so now it's Shannon's turn to update us on some of the things that are going on currently in California. And take it away, Shannon.
Thanks, Cynthia. So, let me start by saying it's just always such a privilege to hear Dr. Goodwin speak, and her depth of knowledge is so incredible. Our president, Elise Hogue, wrote a book called The Lie That Binds that came out earlier this year that also speaks to the intersection between white supremacy and the anti-choice movement. These things are linked. Being anti-abortion was a strategy. They needed that big hot button issue, the next hot button issue, when school segregation had become out of favor, when they needed the next thing. So she actually also has a podcast on it. I really appreciate that historical context, because I do think when we look at the rise of the anti-choice mechanism over the last 40 years and how powerful they've become, recognizing how entrenched they are in the radical right, how they are using disinformation in the way that they are, and how they've built a powerful, deeply powerful machine across this country, from having the Federalist Society and a judicial pipeline, legislative, full entities that write model legislation for anti-choice legislators to pick up and just copy and paste into their own laws across this country, from the clinic protesters and the violence on clinics, which of course we've seen over the years, to the network of fake clinics that we've seen arise across the country, and which have a pretty heavy hold in places like Orange County. The Obria Group is based out of Orange County and is one of the most powerful anti-choice networks of so-called crisis pregnancy centers, which are, again, just fake clinics. They received a couple $1 million from the Trump administration. California is not immune from many of these problems, and that is something that is also worth recognizing. So I want to just, again, really appreciate all of that context. I want to be clear that Naral is not a reproductive justice organization, right? Our founding was founded, it was a white women organization at its founding 50 years ago, and we are the oldest and largest abortion rights advocacy organization in the country. And we at Naral, frankly, have our own continued growth to make sure that we are a very strong ally with our reproductive justice partners. And that is an area that we've been leaning into and continuing to grow into. But I make that point in part because I really appreciated, Cynthia gave me a glowing bio at the front end of this, but let me just say that all of those accomplishments that we have made in the state legislature the last 2 years is a product of the coalition work we've been able to do. On a couple of those bills, Black Women for Wellness was a lead partner in that with us. And we partner with many really all of the reproductive health rights and justice advocacy organizations in the state to do these things in coalition. We don't do it alone, and it doesn't make sense to do it alone. I want to just hit some of the problems we see in California. You know, Dr. Goodwin spoke about eugenics, and we think that this is a thing of the past. But we also know that in California, in our state penitentiaries and jails, women were being forcibly and involuntarily sterilized up until 2010. And we are still working. California Latinas for Reproductive Justice has been working on an effort for the last several years trying to get reparations, a compensation fund for folks who were involuntarily or forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws or in our state penitentiaries and jails. They've been at that for the last couple of years, and it has repeatedly failed. And that is one of the things that you look at a state like California and you think, I mean, it's hard. It actually is like, there's just a cognitive dissonance there. We are so progressive in what we speak to, and yet our actions would not actually indicate that we are willing to put our money where our mouth is, that we are willing to truly say these were wrong, the state takes responsibility for this, and we are going to step up to rectify these things. You know, 40% of California counties do not have an abortion provider. We still have huge access issues in this state. 9 counties do not have an OBGYN, and an additional 19 have fewer than 5 OBGYNs. One of the issues that Black Women for Wellness, Nourbese in particular, has been leading on, and that we've been helping over the last couple of years, is trying to close the really disturbing disparities that persist in Black maternal mortality. Black and Indigenous women in this state continue to be 3 to 4 times more likely to die in a pregnancy-related death than basically everyone else. How do we really make progress in these areas that are steeped in this history that Dr. Goodwin is speaking to, and that require very thoughtful, holistic approaches, really, frankly, reproductive justice approaches that acknowledge economic justice, that acknowledge all of these other measures of justice. And Nourbese will speak more to that after me. One of the things that we are working on too is this increasing footprint of institutions like Dignity Health, St. Joseph's, Providence, these institutions that have discriminatory institution-wide policies of not providing, refusing to provide basic reproductive and LGBTQ plus inclusive healthcare. We are concerned about their footprint overall, their global footprint in this state. We are looking at other states like Washington and even Alaska and Idaho, states where upwards of 40% of their hospital beds are in these hospitals that categorically refuse to provide basic reproductive and LGBTQ care. That is a warning for California that if we do not get a handle on this growing footprint, we are going to be in serious trouble. It does not matter what legal protections you have on the books for access to abortion, to contraception, to bearing healthy children, to miscarriage management, to whatever we think we have on the books to care free from discrimination is irrelevant if we continue to let these institutions grow their footprint in this state. And so, of course, one of the areas in which we've been working through that is how these healthcare refusals have been encroaching into the public sphere, specifically at the University of California, an issue that I know many of you are very aware of, and that Dr. Goodwin has also been working on. And we see the other context of this is the disparities that we have seen exacerbated in the pandemic are the same disparities that are exacerbated in all facets of our healthcare system, certainly of reproductive healthcare and access, quality care, and that requires reproductive justice solutions. So a couple of the things that we are working on this year that we would appreciate support and help. The first is the Abortion Accessibility Act. The bill number is SB 245, and that is a bill that is co-sponsored by Naral, Black Women for Wellness, Access Reproductive Justice, which is California's only abortion fund in the state, and HELP, and also Planned Parenthood. And this is a bill that will remove cost sharing for abortion so that no one is unable to access abortion care in this state because of the cost of that service. This is critically important. We hear nationally about the Hyde Amendment, and obviously we need to undo discriminatory coverage bans on abortion across the board. And as it relates to care in our own state, it is, even covered California, if you have a top-notch plan, you don't have a copay or a deductible. But if you have the bronze plan, you have a copay or a deductible. We need to create more equity within that system. And so removing cost sharing means it'll be free. No copay, no deductible. And I'm sorry, for some reason, my voice feels like it's going. All that breathing with my sister who's in labor. So another bill that we are working on right now is around the University of California and the issues there. So this is SB 379, the Equitable and Inclusive UC Healthcare Act. It's authored by Senator Scott Wiener. And the purpose of this bill is to ensure that all UC providers, regardless of whether they are working in a UC facility or a non-UC facility, are able to provide comprehensive reproductive and LGBTQ care. This has become essential because the UC Board of Regents has basically abdicated their responsibility to draw this conclusion on their own, to take a vote on this issue, and to address the fact that UC has had hundreds of contracts. The latest number we got was that they've now amended 2,000 contracts to supposedly solve this problem. But the reality is that they continue to have to subject UC personnel and student trainees to the religious restrictions on care of the hospital in which they're placed. We obviously want to do away with that and would love your support. I might have to pass the mic to Nourbese because literally my voice is going. And I just want to cough all over the place. So let me I'll mention one other thing, which is the other bill that Naral is sponsoring is the Contraceptive Equity Act of 2021, which is SB 523. In large part, this gets at the fact that we have seen unrelenting attacks and assaults on access to contraceptive care over the last 4 years, the consequences of which are also felt in California. And so we are looking to address some of those things. And I'll pass the mic.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. have some water, and you'll come back for the discussion amongst the group later. Yeah, it's very timely discussion about legislation. We are gathering. We have 6 sections in California who gather together to talk about what kind of advocacy we can put forward for specific legislative bills or budget requests. And we're going to actually be having a meeting later this week to discuss some of those things. So Nourbese, I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. It's always very hard to follow Dr. Goodwin and Shannon. They are amazing. And I'm always like, oh, I just want to hear more from you all. So thank you all for letting me talk a little bit today with y'all. I don't want to take up too much time because I do really want to get to the conversation part of it because I love the conversation pieces. But I thought it would be helpful because we have been using terms like reproductive justice, reproductive rights, reproductive health to have a bit of a way in which we can talk about these things and we all have a conversation where we understand what the terms mean. And so that we're all speaking the same language when we go into this conversation. So I'm going to take a moment and share my screen. Hopefully, after a year of COVID, I've figured out how this works. Y'all see it? Okay. So what I was going to do is give a quick history of reproductive justice, because I think it's important for us to understand the roots of where reproductive justice. I won't go as far back as Dr. Goodwin did, but I will go a little bit further in terms of the future, and then what we can do to achieve reproductive justice and liberation. And then a couple of pieces that I can finish up on some of the policy things that we are looking at this year, as well as things that outside of the traditional ways of which we think about advocacy that we can all engage in the work. So just a little bit about Black Women for Wellness. I will be going back before with Black Women for Wellness and Black Women for Wellness Action Project. The only things is like 1 to C3, 1 to C4. Really, people only care about that if you work for the IRS. So we'll just move on past. So for In Our Own Voice, this is the way we define reproductive justice. So reproductive justice means the human right to control our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. And that right can only be achieved when all people have the complete economic, social, and political power, and in all areas and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies and our families and our communities in all areas of our lives. So this is what we use In Our Own Voice. If you want to see like a textbook definition of reproductive justice, it kind of goes, we say what Dr. Goodwin already said, with everything that has to do with having a child, not having a child, and being able to raise your family with dignity and respect, or be able to raise your family in a sustainable place, right? But because it's an evolving framework, the work of there's a core to it, but there's also other pieces that are still movement. I think the things though is to really understand the characteristics of reproductive justice. I won't go through all of these are from Sister Song, but there's a couple of pieces I do want to hear about, or do want to talk about. One is that it defines the problems of reproductive oppression. And what we mean by that is we're looking at structural barriers. And when we're thinking about how do we achieve reproductive justice, this is not taking out of the space of behavioral changes of individuals, but looking at the structures and what causes the disparities that we see in our communities. So what does that mean in this sense, right? It means if we have Black maternal health, right, issue, or Black maternal mortality issue that we do right now, where Black women are dying 3 to 4 times more likely to die from childbirth than the state's average, right? We're not looking about how do we build Black women stronger or making them resilient, right? That's not the conversation we're trying to have. We're trying to look at the conversation of like, what are causing these disparities, which is racism, and then how do we dismantle those pieces, right? And which is a very kind of unique in a way we look at reproductive justice and how we get there. The other way is that we look at it as the intersectional analysis. RJ was started by Black women for Black women as a gift to the reproductive space, right? And a part of that, and the part of the reason why reproductive justice was coined and this framework was looked at is because of not being able to see yourselves in the reproductive rights or the second wave of feminism, as well as not seeing themselves in the civil rights space, right? So it's this intersection of reproductive rights and social justice. And this is a space where we had created this after 94, so after the Cairo conference in 94, and it was a conversation of how do we look at full selves? And intersectional was also created by a Black woman, or then the phrase was created by a Black woman, which was Kimberly Crenshaw. And then again, we link individuals to their communities and use organizing and advocacy to work on institutional change. I think this is a really important conversation because these are phrases that we keep using as well. And this is the conversation between equality, equity, and liberation. When I think about the work that we're doing in reproductive justice, I think of it as a liberation, not the work of equality or equity. Equity is a term that we're hearing a lot in a lot of our policy right now. We're going to look for racial equity. We're doing gender equity work, right? And those conversations are happening in policy. You're actually going to probably see a lot of policies in California that are talking about equity, right? But what does that really mean when we're seeing equity? And for us, it is a step in the right direction, right? But that is not the space in which we are thinking of what we are achieving reproductive justice, that is, what is our dream of reproductive justice, what is the place of liberation? It is how do we remove these barriers, right? How do we dismantle the systems that are causing these structural inequalities, not have people do a little bit better in the space with the structures are still there. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is just, I talked a little bit about this before. This is a letter that was, you probably, I don't know if you could see the full thing, but it's a full page ad that ran in the Washington Post. And this is the kind of first kind of announcement of reproductive justice, where Black women signed this letter that was coming out to, and it was sent to Congress, right? And it's sent to say that we need to be thinking about all these issues, and reproductive rights is a part of an issue that we care about and cannot be left on the chopping block, particularly when we're talking about the overall healthcare. After this, the framework of reproductive justice kept getting, I don't want to say kept getting, but like it was molded, and that's and come together, and conversations happened, and the framework kind of came out of these spaces where our organization that we think of was birthed out of it when we think about reproductive justice, which was Sister Song. So I talked about this already. So I did want to give a conversation about the difference with reproductive rights. So reproductive rights, when we think about reproductive rights, I think about the laws and systems. So reproductive rights are Roe v. Wade. They are conversations that are looking at policies and legislation, something extremely important to the work, right? Something that is needed in our work, but is not reproductive justice, nor is it reproductive health. And so like organizations that I think about who work on reproductive rights are Naral, our ACLU, right? They work on these policies that are particularly important. I will say though, when thinking about rights, sometimes there is limitations, right? And sometimes there isn't an intersectional solution or a solution to this debate, a solution that's thought through in policy. Sometimes it's black and white when people are thinking about reproductive rights. The one example that I would give, and I'm gonna pick on our friends a little bit at the ACLU, I love them, but very oftentimes you'll hear about the ACLU defending white supremacists or KKK folks on freedom of speech, right? And it's like, we need to make sure that we protect it for the folks who, like in every space before, and if we protect it for the KKK, then it protects it for us, right? And in the reproductive justice spaces, there is a little bit of tension there in those conversations, because we're looking at a system, particularly in America, that upholds white supremacy at all the time. And we don't think that it needs protecting in the same way, right? And we know that there's different people who have different access to laws and policies, even though they're on the books for everybody. People have different access to what they actually mean in implementation. And so in some ways, right, when we work around reproductive rights and looking at straight up in the policy space, sometimes there is this tension here when we're thinking about what does that mean in the overall ways of how we're thinking about structure and dismantling structures. Reproductive health, and the way I think about reproductive health, and this is also again created with, it was us in California Latinas for Reproductive Justice created this a while ago, is thinking about it in the sense of everything that we are thinking about for when we cover a bikini or a swimsuit or whatever male body people wear for their swimming. I can't think of it. Trunks. There we go. Oh, y'all, it's been a long day. Anyways, and so that is reproductive rights. So it's the things that, again, super, super, super important, right? And, you know, I don't want to hear a whole story about like, you know, the structural systems when I'm trying to get my birth control. I want to get my birth control, right? Are in all those pieces. And so those are really important pieces, right? But again, it focuses on the individual usually and the health equities, right? Or the health inequities, right? And care, but it's not looking at the macro or meso levels of the work. So I wanted to talk a little bit about all the things that were happening before and like what are impacting women of color, everything. Everything. I literally can give a whole day seminar on all the issues that are impacting women of color, particularly Black women, of things that have happened before, in the before times, before COVID, right? And then also things that are still happening now and things that we still need to fix, even with Biden and the administration, right? Because he reversed some of the Title X pieces, but didn't go far enough for us in the reproductive world and thinking about what does it mean for access. And so there's lots of conversations to have, but I did want to raise a couple of things to the top. And that is at the center of all of the work, the structural pieces, I believe, and we believe in the work, is that if we dismantle racism, sexism and patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, that a lot of the other issues that are surrounding health inequities, economic inequities, environment and climate change, all these other pieces also get dismantled in that work, because at the center, the same oppression, the same things are holding up all these oppressions that we are seeing and feeling for many of our communities. So I said I want to talk a little bit about RJ in action and what things that we could do, because I don't want to leave on this note of like doom and gloom. And also, I mean, there is a lot to be doom and gloom, let me not say that. But I do want to give some things that we could do, because I promised. So what does that mean? So one thing I always tell folks is to start at home. There is a lot that we can do to do public education with your friends and family. A lot of times when we're thinking about massive systems and breaking down systems, we're always thinking about what we can do out there, but having conversations like this, having conversations in your homes, having conversation with your friends, and doing the public education around racism, white supremacy, around patriarchy, around misogyny, those things would be super helpful. And if we could all start there and making sure that at least our friends and family are on point, right? It could do a world for doing the culture change that we need, what we need to see in order for us to actually get to this liberation. Join organizations and respond to call to actions. I say this in particular, yes, Black Women for Wellness would like you to respond to our actions, but as well as many other organizations. It is our job to figure out how these pieces are working, and it is extremely difficult to figure out policy, particularly in California, about like what's going and how it's happening. There are laws that sound great that are terrible, and there's laws that sound terrible that are actually kind of good, right? And so those are the pieces, and joining organizations to help figure out those pieces are super helpful. And when we ask for call to actions, it is super helpful to send those call to actions in, whether it's emails or phone calls or tweets, because it helps us flex our muscle that people care about these issues, right? And so oftentimes our bills are measured by how many phone calls that we can get in, or how many emails that we can get into a legislator's office. Be proactive about supporting women of color publicly. So many times I've been in spaces where like Black women or other women of color have said something and said something courageous. And then people have came after the meeting and been like, that was so great, girl, right? But kind of left that person hanging in the meeting by themselves, right? This is, for me, if we're going to like talk about solidarity and allyship, that needs to be a public allyship and public solidarity. It is, yes, helpful if you are internally good for these things. It is more helpful when we are externally thinking about how we are engaging that and how we are not letting people of color hold the weight, particularly in meetings and other spaces when we are trying to talk about dismantling racism or other hard issues. I won't go through all of these in such detail, but I did want to talk a little bit about like if we have business waiting areas or clinics and things like that. Everything is political, every space is political, and let's be creative about ways we can use that. If you have a business or a waiting room, can we put voter registration spaces for like people can register to vote? Is there spaces that we can do to put some education about organizations that are dope and are doing the good work? Are there ways that we can use different pieces of our office spaces or other pieces to actually help and do some of that work and push that forward? Thinking about how we are having both looking at implicit and explicit biases. Can we practice blind hiring, right? Are we looking at our hiring practices? Does your staff look like the community that you serve? And have we went out of our way to think about and look for making sure that we have communities that are the people who are in our communities, that we have those folks on board and talking to them, particularly when we're thinking about solutions. Being intentional about speaking to the community, yes. Having intersectional approaches to the work is particularly important. And so always thinking, or let me back up. When BWW engages in our work, we think about, yes, the policy piece of it, but thinking about the other ways in which this can go great or not so great for communities, and thinking about the ways in which we need to think about more than the policy sometimes in order to move the ball forward, right? And so always thinking about people's full selves in the work is super important. And again, everything is political, right? A lot of times, and I don't have to say this to this group, but I know in a lot of spaces, folks think about or have these conversations about, well, you know, I'm not just that political. I'm not into policies that much, or, you know, I think it's bad taste to talk about politics, right? And we need to be engaging, particularly with our friends and families, on those pieces, because it is a privilege not to be able to think about policies and politics, right? It is a privilege to not be able to, like, oh, this doesn't bother me. But for some people, it bothers them, or it impacts them every single day of their lives and every decision that they make or cannot make, right? And so everything is political, and we have to make sure that we're holding people accountable who can, right, think about these pieces. So the one other thing that I wanted to put or talk about was also one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Ruha Benjamin. She is like my fangirl. I'm the fangirl of her work so much. It's the battle over world power tomorrow begins with the struggle of who gets to dream today, right? And so this has to come to stay, and thinking about the future of our work and where do we get to go is thinking about who gets to ask the questions, who's in the room, who gets to create the parameters in which we even think of what is possible, right? Because a lot of times, particularly when we talk about policy, we'll have these conversations, particularly in the repro health, repro rights, and repro justice space. And what is told is, well, that's not possible, Nourbese, you're thinking too big, right? Or that's not possible because, you know, this will never happen. And the folks we have to also think about who decided to put those parameters on what is actually possible to do, right? And there are structures for everything. And so just like racism is a structure, is something that is built and it's held up, right? That it is also pieces that we can dismantle, but we also have to think about it as something that we can dismantle. And so those are the conversations and things that I would love for us to start thinking about when we are engaging in conversations with folks about how are we always thinking about dismantling the ideas that are holding up some of these structural barriers and oppressions that are happening to communities of color. And the last thing I will say very quickly is to talk a little bit about the policy that we hope is one of the ones that are a little bit more dreamy, is this California Mama Bus bill that we have introduced this year. And so it doesn't have a number yet. We should get a number by the end of the week. But the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because this is a whole bunch of different organizations, including Naral, that came together and started thinking about what is the ceiling and not the floor for maternal health. Right? Because our conversations are always at the floor of like, what can we do at the bottom, the lowest hanging fruit on how we can close the gap, how we can make things a little bit better. And we wanted to actually have a piece of legislation and introduce a piece of legislation that says, well, actually, what does it look like for us to have better health, right? Are people have joyous births, right? Are people feel good about how they had the birthing process as much as you can? I know some parts of it you might not feel so great about. Depending on who you are. But yes, those pieces are, I think, are the ones that we want to be thinking about and pushing. And so that's why we are envisioning this California Mama Bus, but also hoping that it does have leads to other bills that are more visionary in the way we think about them. So maybe they don't get past year 1 or year 2, right? But it's something that we can work on as a community, that we can organize around, that we get people excited about, have them talking to their legislators about. So eventually, maybe 3-4 years down the line, that we actually have policy that is doing more than just what I call grabbing folks out of the water or the trauma space, but actually looking upstream where we can actually have those kind of joyous, liberated type visions of life in our future, our children's future. So with that, I will end there just to make sure that we have some time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Nourbese. Wow, after all of you have spoken, I'm struck, as I'm sure everybody in the audience is, with the amount of information. And what I have found to be really helpful is the frameworks, both the historical framework and the current framework, the definitions of reproductive justice, reproductive rights, is very helpful in terms of thinking through how we can become involved. So I'd like to turn it over to the three of you to have some discussion about that. And then, when the time is right, we'll go to some Q&A and, invite people again to put your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll go from there. So.
Well, it sounds like a good idea for folks to lift up their concerns and their questions in the chat so that we can have that dialogue. But perhaps I'll start. Since I have a podcast, I have no problem asking questions of my panelists here. So tell me, what you see as the most frightening aspect of the times that we're in when we think about the context of this evening's engagement.
Yeah, I think there's like a layered question, and I also would love if you also answer that question. But for me, I think just the kind of unadulterated or unfeathered, or I don't know if that's the right word, kind of push back to white supremacy in a way that is just not being checked. And I say this in the sense of, we all saw the insurrection. And one of the common conversations that were happening is like, if Black lives or Black people were up and trying to do that, we would have never made it.
If there were 2 Black people that tried to storm the Capitol, it would have been all done, locked down in Black communities all across the country because 2 Black people tried to storm inside the Capitol. That's the horror, right? Because we all know, fill in the blank, whatever community, to Muslims, to people who were, non-documented, whatever that just happened, it would have been that. And yet to see the horror of that, the Confederate flag made its way through the Capitol.
Right, which is like never happened, right? And I think for me, that was shocking in itself. In a sense, because I think I was watching it real time. And then I think it's not shocking, but it still was like, is that how our certain party in our system was just also like, well, we should just forget about it and move on. And then that same those same folks are also continuously to dismantle our systems, right? And then also trying to deflect in ways to not have us actually look at and see what is really causing the oppression in our world, in our country. And I think the biggest example also right now in the moment is like looking at the conversation coming out of Texas, where they're trying to blame it on the Green New
I was gonna say,
Deal.
like, which one, the Ted Cruz heading down to the Ritz-Carlton, or like which of the, Shannon, you have to go off mute, right? Because I need you in this conversation, right? Seriously. I mean, what was it? And Nourbese set the table in a bit, about what she observed. And I agree, like, let there be some brown people who had tried to storm the Capitol in that way. Were you watching in lifetime? Does that reflect, when you think about what concerns you, what kind of harms the soul and mind, is that a part of it? Something else?
I mean, yeah, it's so layered, right? Like, I think the sort of sign off on white supremacy that we've just seen, like white supremacy has a platform. They've had a president. They've had a president for the last 4 years that has so emboldened them that it is that I mean, that alone is terrifying. I'm a white person who I honestly can tell you that white people are the most terrifying to me. I also am worried, though, it's not just about them, because my hope is that Trump will become irrelevant or die. Sorry, just, it could happen. Just irrelevant and stop having the measure of influence that he has. I think we also have to be nervous about incrementalism and how people think, as they did with getting Obama into office, think that with Biden in the White House, they can become complacent again and that things are going to be okay and that Biden will reverse the very toxic policies of Trump. So, it's not going to be enough to simply undo the damage that Trump did. And B, will he even do that? And we don't know that for certain. We have that together stacked up with the fact that we lost pretty badly in state legislatures across this country. So we thought that gerrymandering was bad over the last decade. That gerrymandering is going to continue into this decade. And that is going to be very, very problematic. We know, as folks who work on state level things, right? Like, I lead the state of California for Naral. So much of what actually people's lives are like is dictated by state legislatures.
Well, on that note, I've pulled up Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and I think it resonates with both ends of what you both were just talking about, because he says, I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with a white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to the positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in goal and the goals you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another person's freedom. And he goes on from there, but I think that it reflects that tension that you were both speaking to right there. It's pretty powerful. I want to remind our listeners and those who are watching that you can lift up questions in the chat. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to continue on, because this is my zone. I love doing this. So, it strikes me that we're in a time where people also wonder about and you have to let me know how much time it is too that we have, because I'll just go on and on. So
So we're at 8:15, and we said that we would wrap up around 8:30. I'll throw out a question.
Yes.
So we've talked about people's complacency, and there is a lot of that to go around, unfortunately. But in the arena of reproductive rights, it seems that there are a number of things going on kind of under the radar. I mean, whether it's the criminalization of women who miscarry and are then charged for crimes, or it's the stuff going on with the pardon, my landline is ringing, excuse me. Whether it's the University of California and Dignity Health. So how do we start to encourage people to be more activated, and how do we encourage their activism and say you can't be complacent? Yes, it's California and we're a progressive state, but there's all this stuff that we still need to worry about.
I mean, I think like it is up to us to say those conversations, right? I tell my folks that, you know, revolution is not a spectator sport. As in that if we expect change to happen, we got to be a part of it. And it's one of the things that I'm still trying to figure out and pushing folks, right? I think a lot of the repro world has like, we got to not slow down, right? Even though a lot of us are very tired because the last 4 years have kicked our butts. But it's still a space that we've already seen some of the drop off. And I think we have to have other messengers to push those conversations. But I'm curious on what other folks think.
So I think it's worth mentioning that as much as Roe v. Wade is really a right in name only in many parts of this country, if Roe falls, abortion will be straight up criminalized, illegal in about half of the United States. And so that alone, I think, is when you actually show folks a map of this, like they're like, I mean, California, talk about like having to step up to the plate. What would fall on California as far as being this island of access? In the pandemic alone, we saw over 10,000, more than that, I'm certain, but Planned Parenthood alone saw 7,000 out-of-state patients during the COVID-19 pandemic. Folks have had to come to our state to get care here because other states have tried to weaponize the pandemic to shut down access. And we have to think, I mean, this is Cynthia, you mentioned what's going on with people being prosecuted for pregnancy loss, investigated because of a miscarriage or some kind of miscarriage that they can't explain away, right? We know that a spontaneous and an induced miscarriage, one is called an abortion, one is called a miscarriage. They're the same thing and they're indistinguishable. So of course, as access is denied across this country, people are looking to different safe ways to solve their problem. Medication abortion is safe, FDA approved. If they can get their hands on it and use it, they will if they need access to care. And they can do that in their own home. But then they run this risk in our legal framework. And this is something that we think California would be immune from. But even we've seen a couple of women who have been recently prosecuted, and one is sitting in jail related to a stillbirth because they said that she caused that it was on her. So how far down that path do you go? What are we going to hold a woman responsible for doing or for not doing to protect a pregnancy? You didn't take your prenatal vitamins. Is that a criminal offense? You were carrying heavy boxes. Is that a criminal offense? Where does this line get drawn where we are not investigating these folks? And this is fundamentally about where we started, which is racism and sexism. And that is why this reproductive justice conversation is the fundamental lens that we all really do have to adjust ourselves and adapt ourselves into having it's not these isolated things. It is a whole picture ecosystem.
I think they said it so brilliantly. What is there really to add? Here's just a sliver, though, which is to say that it's important that government take action to protect these rights and to protect health. And the Biden administration can go far, and so can this Congress, in righting the tide that has been so dramatically disrupted. And they should take responsibility to do so. The same is true when one thinks about the state legislatures, which have turned red. So while people are celebrating Biden and Kamala Harris being in the White House, the truth of it is that more states than not now have conservative legislatures. And so it's really important to rally people to run for office too. You see what's happening in Texas right now. And for those who will see this later on in a recording, remember the time in which Texas has been racked by snow and cold and pipes freezing and children dying of hypothermia and mothers dying in their garages with their children trying to keep warm in their cars and families having to huddle while burning whatever they can in their fireplaces and having to boil water. And remember that that is a state that is the deadliest place in the developed world for a person to be pregnant. And remember that it is a predominantly overwhelmingly white male legislature that has pushed through some of the most draconian anti-abortion legislation. You can't separate it. It is all connected, that irresponsibility, that lack of capacity, that wanting to push the buck off of onto someone else. And as one thinks about it and just stitching that conversation together, it's worth noting that one of the most vocal anti-abortion leaders in the United States, Ted Cruz, when things got tough and mothers died and children died while trying to keep warm in his state, he headed towards the Ritz-Carlton in Cancun, Mexico. I think, that kind of lack of responsibility for the things that people helped to set in place. Now, he's not a state legislator, he's a federal legislator, but he certainly has used his voice and has used his political power in such ways that have only furthered the initiatives to strip away reproductive health protections for the most vulnerable of people. And I think that has to be part of this conversation.
Well, we did have some questions from the crowd. So we'll start with, what is the panel's reaction to the recently introduced legislation in South Carolina restricting abortion after 6 weeks? Does it have a reality of passing? Is it going to end up at the Supreme Court?
I'll let Shannon take that.
I think we should let Dr. Goodwin take that.
Well, here's the thing, which is that the backdrop of these anti-abortion measures are is sort of death by 1,000 strikes. It's an effort to see which one will take hold. And it's important to know that there is a battle of contestation within this movement, right? It's not necessarily a coherent movement. It's been very successful, so it seems like it's coherent. But if you think about the violence of the 1970s and 80s, there's a movement within a movement that's like, let's just burn it all down. Let's just blow it up. Let's have a 4-week abortion ban. And then there are the others who are far more sophisticated and strategic, and what they want are real wins. You might see this as a kind of hybrid between the two, but a 6-week abortion ban will not go far. But then you look at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is no longer that 1973 Supreme Court of Roe v. Wade. It's not a 1992 Supreme Court either. But it is a Supreme Court of June Medical v. Rousseau, which is a bit of a nuanced complication that one can't overread, because as Chief Justice John Roberts, siding with the liberals on the court at the time, and at the time Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still on the court, one of the things that you could read out of John Roberts was that he was not willing to trample on the rule of law and the protection of precedent as in a very narrow way, with whole woman's health that the court had just ruled on in 2016. And this was a Louisiana law basically challenging the court's decision in this 2016 case. And he sided with the liberals, right? So that was very clear that there is legitimacy, or at least he was trying to project legitimacy in the Supreme Court. But let's keep in mind that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed. Justice Amy Coney Barrett is on the court. And the guarantee of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, because Roe is gone, is not necessarily secure. It is vulnerable, but will 6 weeks do it? I'm not sure that it will.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the South Carolina law, I actually hadn't seen that it was signed already. It was signed by the governor last week. I don't anticipate this will get before the Supreme Court, but only because it's like 10th in line behind several other states that have already passed 6-week abortion bans, right? We have Georgia, we have Kentucky, Louisiana. I mean, the list is long at this point. There are 30-ish cases in front of the Supreme Court that exactly undermine our direct threat to Roe and to Planned Parenthood v. Casey, many of them. So the legal landscape, the judicial landscape is a very scary place. It is one of the reasons that it is actually so hard right now for us to fight back against things like these institutional healthcare refusals. It's a fraught landscape with the courts being stacked the way they are. You know, it's not just the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court itself is 6-3 anti-choice majority, 6-3 for probably a long time, right? That is not looking like that will be getting much better anytime soon, but it's also the lower courts where Trump was able to secure about 200 anti-choice judges in the lower courts. So it does really impact how we're able to make an impact in this space. We have to be very creative so that we are able to navigate the legal systems, the judicial system, and have things stand up in court.
Let's move to California legislation. Nourbese, you talked about SB 379, which was the legislation regarding the University of California practitioners. What do you think of its possibility of passing? What can we do to help it pass? What actions can our organization take?
So that was Shannon's bill.
Okay.
And yeah, you go ahead and then I can just talk about general legislation.
Yeah. So I will say the purpose with this bill is the same as the advocacy that we've been doing with the regions, which is to fix the problem. And we are impartial as to whether it is through legislation that this is resolved. We would actually prefer, frankly, that the regions address this issue on their own. They have the power to do it. It is, frankly, unconscionable that they have just sat on this for the last, 2 years. The working group resolved about a year ago. The public process became completely stalled. And then we discovered through the ACLU's Public Records Act requests that new contracts had been signed between UC Health and Dignity, apparently between all of the other religiously affiliated contracts that they have. And they say that the problem is resolved. UC Health does. The problem is not resolved. Those contracts do not fundamentally change the dynamic where you see practitioners and student trainees will be unable to actually provide comprehensive care when they're in non-UC facilities. So it's going to be a hard fight. The legislation is going to be very hard. And that's because we are up against extraordinarily powerful opposition. We are, of course, all of the religiously affiliated hospitals will oppose. Their hospital alliance will oppose. We will likely have the California Hospital Association opposing, though we are hoping to neutralize that. We could have the California Medical Association oppose. Unfortunately, because they are very close with the University of California, of course, we're going to have the University of California likely oppose. So we are talking about these very powerful systems who have a lot of money, have a lot of influence. And this bill is sponsored by Naral, an advocacy organization, right? We are all of 3 full-time staff in California. I mean, like, Equality California is also sponsoring the bill, and ACLU of California. So advocates, right, who represent people and truly care about the impact that these policies are having. How you can help, I mean, literally in every way, like by when we have calls to action, as Nourbese was saying earlier, calling into the committee hearing to show your support. We're going to have a petition circulating that folks can sign on to send an email to their legislator to let them know that you are urging them to support this bill. We, you know, we'll also have opportunities to make phone calls, lobby meetings. I mean, there's going to be a variety of different ways that folks can get involved, and I'm happy to make sure that all of you have that information.
Yeah, good. Is there Nourbese, you said the California Mom Nuts bill doesn't have a number yet. Does it have a sponsor?
Well, we have an author, which is Nancy Skinner. Yes. Sponsors is BWW, Question Center. I think Naral's getting on, and a couple of other pieces. But really quickly, because I know we're out of time, I just wanted to say that there are a couple of ways that we can always be like pushing our legislators, right? Right now, the Senate is a lot more progressive. The Assembly is not so much, and it's a tougher assembly. We don't have to wait for a piece of legislation to start talking to our legislators about what we care about. You can have meetings with them right now and be like, hey, I just want to make sure you know that we that we are watching you, that we care about these issues, and we want you to do something on those issues. And so continuously having those conversations and building them up, and say that there are people who are watching what you are doing and on your votes on these issues, I think is particularly important to all progressive issues, right, that we're working on. And setting up those meetings and bringing community out are great ways to set up the legislator to be responsive. And then we got a lot of special elections and a lot of other stuff coming on. So also be willing to also take the stick when it comes to elections as well, which is every 2 years, for our assembly, and say, you know what, we looked at what happened. We didn't like what you did. We're going to find somebody else.
Okay, Cynthia?
Okay, I think since it's even a little past 8:30, and for Shannon it's 11:30, pushing towards midnight, I will close for now. This has been a fantastic evening. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers, and to you, our audience, most of whom have hung out with us this whole time. We will be in touch with you in terms of follow-up advocacy activities coming out of tonight's discussion, and as they occur, it could be a call to action, it could be sign a petition, it could be go meet with your local legislator, call your legislator, send emails, whatever. So we'll see what we can come up with. I also wanted to say a special thank you to our Zoom team. So Deb and Dale and I have been working overtime to try to learn more about how best to conduct these Zoom meetings so that we can continue to bring you engaging virtual panel discussions and other activities. Speaking of which, if you would share your screen right now, Deb, thank you. We have a couple of terrific advocacy panel discussions coming up next month. On Sunday, March 7th, we have a program on immigration, and that will feature speakers on the status of the Biden administration's immigration bill, current policies regarding refugees and asylum seekers, and opportunities for local and national advocacy. I don't know what happened there.
I don't either.
And then on Sunday, I'll just mention on Sunday, March 21st, we're partnering with the Long Beach League of Women Voters to present a program on homelessness. Speakers will include reps from the United Way and providers of affordable housing and community services. So please join us for these stimulating and educational programs in March. And until then, stay safe and well, and let's give some virtual applause to our speakers tonight. Thank you so much. You can hear my applause anyway.
Shannon, wish your sister very easy birth tomorrow, and do let us know.
Yeah, let us know.
Please.
Right.
Get,
Great.
get some
Thank you
sleep.
so much. We'll be following up with all of you. Thanks again.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
Bye now. Thank you.
Thank-
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.